I was in the middle of a long road trip across the country, heading west to meet up with my family and a few friends. To break up the drive, I booked a small cabin for one night. The idea was simple. I'd be there maybe 10 or 12 hours max. Just grab some food, take a shower, get a few hours of sleep, and hit the road again early the next morning. By the time I finally arrived, I'd already been driving for about 9 hours straight and was completely exhausted. Almost immediately, something felt off. The cabin was way more secluded than I had pictured. Maybe it only seemed that way because it was late at night and surrounded by woods, but still, it wasn't what I was expecting at all. In my head, I imagined it being part of a small group of cabins, like a little rental area where other people might be staying nearby. Instead, this place was completely on its own. No neighboring cabins, no lights, just one building sitting there by itself. I pulled into the gravel spot out front and went inside. The first thing that caught my attention was the front door. It didn't match the cabin at all. Nothing was wrong with it technically, but it stood out in a strange way. The door was solid, modern and heavy-looking, while the rest of the cabin was old wood and had a very rustic feel. It felt like it belonged to an entirely different building. Inside, the cabin was basically one small room. The bed, couch, kitchenette and TV were all squeezed into the same space. Everything about it felt dated, like stepping into another time. I didn't linger though. I threw together some dinner, ate quickly and got ready for bed. I was exhausted, so I fell asleep almost instantly, but not long after, maybe an hour later, I suddenly woke up. There was no sound, no movement, just a strange feeling that pulled me out of sleep. I know it sounds unbelievable, but the second I woke up, this heavy sense of dread hit me for no clear reason. I sat straight up in bed and just listened, trying to figure out if something had woken me, but the cabin was completely quiet, no sounds at all. Still feeling on edge, I slowly leaned over and looked out the window beside the bed. I honestly expected to see nothing, but almost immediately I noticed movement deep in the trees. At first it was hard to make out, but after watching for a few seconds, I could tell by the way it moved. It was a person. That realization sent a chill through me. Why would anyone be out there? It was insanely dark outside. I'm not exaggerating when I say you could barely see anything at all. The woods were thick, and there wasn't even moonlight or starlight breaking through the trees. I watched the figure for maybe half a minute before it disappeared completely into the darkness. I stayed frozen by the window, waiting to see if it would come back into view. After several minutes passed and nothing happened, I finally laid back down. I knew the next day would be another long stretch of driving, so I tried to force myself to sleep. But it didn't work. I was lying there with my eyes shut for what felt like forever, probably close to 40 minutes, when I suddenly heard something outside the cabin. Before my brain could even register the sound, there was a sharp knock on the door. The entire cabin was just one open room, so the door was only a few feet away from where I was lying. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no other way out. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing so hard it felt like my chest was going to explode. I don't think I'd ever been that terrified in my life. Then a man's voice shouted from the other side of the door. He sounded angry, almost aggressive, and hearing him only made the fear worse. I froze, completely unsure if I should answer him or stay silent, not knowing what to do next. There was no doubt he knew I was in there. My car was parked right out front. It wasn't exactly subtle. I grabbed my phone and immediately tried calling 911, but the call didn't connect right away. I'm pretty sure I had little to no signal, so my phone was struggling to make the call, probably trying to switch over to data. Those few seconds felt endless. Eventually, it went through, and I got connected to an operator. They told me officers were being dispatched. Meanwhile, the guy outside was still pounding on the door. I honestly couldn't tell if he was just slamming his fists against it or actually trying to force his way inside. Either way, it sounded violent. Thankfully, the door held. After another minute or two, the noise suddenly stopped, and I heard him step off the porch. For a brief moment, I thought it was over, until I heard the sound of glass breaking. I knew instantly it had to be my car. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. There were clear signs that he'd taken off back into the woods, but given how dark it was and how dense the forest was, the officers weren't about to chase him in the middle of the night. Things took an even stranger turn once the cabin owner got involved. He admitted that something almost identical had happened before. A previous guest had been woken up in the middle of the night by someone pounding on the door and screaming, but for whatever reason, they never called the police. According to the owner, when that guest checked out the next morning, he went to inspect the place and found the door completely destroyed. It looked like it had been smashed in with something heavy, maybe a sledgehammer. Instead of reporting it, the owner decided to stay quiet. He apparently worried that if the incident became public, no one would ever rent the cabin again. So rather than tell anyone, he just swapped out the damaged door for a much stronger one and moved on like nothing happened. That really messed with my head. I still don't know how I feel about it. At the end of the day, though, I was just relieved to put that place behind me and finally make it to the West Coast to see my family and friends. Maybe I could have pushed the situation further or asked more questions, but I honestly just wanted it all to be over. Whatever that man showed up to the cabin intending to do is something I'll probably never stop wondering about. From 2018 to 2020, I was working at a gas station. Definitely not a dream job, but at that point in my life, it paid the bills. I always pushed my manager to put me on the overnight shift. In my head, it sounded perfect, quieter, easier, and I wouldn't have to deal with anyone else. The first year, I was stuck on normal daytime hours, but once my second year rolled around, he finally started scheduling me for nights. And yeah, I was right about one thing. There was barely any work, and being alone was actually pretty nice. What I didn't expect, though, was just how painfully boring those shifts could be. After 10 p.m., the place was basically dead. I mean, almost no customers at all, and the few that did stop by never even came inside. They just paid at the pump and left. There were nights where I genuinely had nothing to do. I ended up killing time however I could. Sometimes, out of pure boredom, I'd step outside and just wander around the parking lot. That's how slow it was. So when this particular night started, I figured it would be no different than the rest. By the time midnight hit, I was already desperate for anything to keep my brain occupied. I figured taking out the trash by the pumps would kill a little time, at least for a few minutes. So I grabbed a handful of trash bags, stepped outside, and started emptying a couple of the bins. Once they were full, I walked around to the back of the building to dump them in the dumpster, and that's when my heart almost jumped out of my chest. There was a guy standing right behind it. I hadn't noticed him at all when I walked up. "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there," I blurted out, more embarrassed than anything, still trying to calm myself down. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me, completely blank, like there was no emotion behind his eyes. As I headed back toward the front of the store, it finally hit me how strange that was. Why would someone be hanging out behind the building right by the dumpsters? He didn't look homeless or like he was digging through trash, so it didn't make sense. I kept glancing over my shoulder while I finished emptying the rest of the cans. When I eventually worked up the nerve to go back and throw them away, the guy was gone. No sign of him anywhere. I dumped the rest of the trash and went back inside. Looking back, maybe I should have been more concerned, but at the time it didn't feel like a big deal. There were other businesses nearby that stayed open late, and a bar down the street where people were always walking past the station. I convinced myself he was probably just cutting through the back of the building, and I happened to catch him at a really awkward moment. I brushed it off, telling myself he was probably just some drunk acting weird. I checked my phone, 12:15 a.m. I rested my arms on the counter, trying to figure out how I was going to survive the rest of the night, when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. I turned toward the doorway that led into the back room. I was almost positive I saw movement. At first, it didn't really scare me. I just assumed I was exhausted, and my eyes were playing tricks on me. And honestly, with nothing better to do, I figured I might as well take a look. I slowly walked over, tilting my head slightly as I tried to peer around the edge of the doorway. The lights back there were off, but the second I reached the entrance, I saw someone pressed up against the wall, way too close, like they were hiding and waiting for me to step inside. The moment I froze and realized what I was seeing, they suddenly stepped out from around the corner. It was the same guy I'd seen earlier behind the building, but his face was completely different now. I've never been able to shake that look. It was pure rage mixed with something unhinged. I barely even registered the knife in his hand before he slashed it toward me. Instinct kicked in. I threw myself backward, slammed into a shelf behind me, and then bolted straight out of the store. I didn't stop running until I was a good distance away. Once I felt somewhat safe, I called 911. Standing there on the street, I couldn't tell if he'd come out of the store or not. The fog that night made it impossible to see anything clearly. By the time the police showed up, he was gone, vanished. The only explanation I could come up with was that he was homeless and unstable, even though he didn't look the part. Maybe he planned to kill me and rob the place. Or maybe he was just completely unhinged and decided that night was the night he'd act on something dark, for no reason at all. I'll probably never know. All I do know is I didn't work there much longer after that, and I never heard a single thing about him ever again. It was a completely normal night at home, one of those quiet evenings where nothing out of the ordinary was happening at all. I was stretched out on the couch, flipping through TV channels, enjoying the fact that I could stay up late since the weekend was long. I lived alone in a pretty standard suburban house. A few months earlier, I'd gone through a rough breakup, and instead of selling the place, I decided to keep it. But that's a whole different story. Anyway, it was probably around 10 or 11 at night. I was relaxing with a cold Budweiser in my hand when, out of nowhere, I heard a noise. It sounded like a knock, but not from the front door. That would have been weird enough at that hour. This sound came from behind me, somewhere toward the back of the house. I left the TV on and got up to check it out. At first, it sounded like something tapping against a window, which didn't really make sense, so I figured maybe something had just fallen over. I walked down the hallway, glanced into the family room, then the kitchen, but everything looked completely normal. Nothing was out of place, so I went back and sat down. I'll admit, I'm probably less cautious than most people. I didn't really dwell on it. I just brushed it off, assuming it was nothing important. I stayed on the couch for a bit longer, still relaxing and drinking, when I heard it again. That same tapping sound, clear as day, hitting a window. The second time around, I was almost positive that's exactly what it was. I got up and checked the house again, moving through the rooms one more time, but this time something immediately felt wrong. One of the back windows was wide open. So was the door leading down to the basement. If it had just been one of those, I probably could have convinced myself it was nothing. But both of them being open, combined with the sounds I'd heard earlier, that was way too much to ignore. I know now how reckless this was, but in that moment, I felt like I had to see the basement for myself. The alcohol definitely didn't help my decision-making, and if I'm being honest, I was a bigger guy with a pretty inflated sense of confidence. I wasn't about to bolt out of my own house and let someone get away without checking. I stood there for a second, staring down into the dark stairwell. There was no noise coming from below. That silence almost made it worse. I slowly started down the creaking steps and switched on the weak overhead light. Since I'd moved in, I don't think I'd ever gone into the basement at night. There was never a reason to. It was unfinished and basically just empty space. When I reached the bottom, I realized how little the lights actually helped. The basement was still mostly swallowed by darkness. Every corner felt like a potential hiding spot, and that's when the fear really hit me. The buzz wore off instantly. I turned around and got out of there as fast as I could, shutting the door behind me and dragging the nearest heavy piece of furniture over to block it. I called the police right away, and by pure luck, an officer was already nearby, just on the edge of the neighborhood. He arrived almost immediately. He went straight inside, flashlight in one hand and his weapon drawn, and headed down to check the basement. It took him less than 10 seconds to find someone. A man was crouched in a dark corner near the bottom of the stairs. When I realized how close he'd been, my stomach dropped. I had been only 3 or 4 feet away from him when I went down there earlier. He was armed too, holding a large kitchen knife. Thankfully, he didn't resist when the officer confronted him and was taken into custody without a struggle. To this day, I still don't understand why he broke into my house. He claimed he was just looking for shelter from the weather, which didn't add up at all. The conditions outside were fine, and police later discovered he wasn't even homeless. He had his own apartment downtown and a steady job. That night was the closest I've ever come to losing my life. What really messes with me is how sudden and random it all was. How easily it could have ended for no real reason at all. If there's anything to take away from it, it's this: never let your guard down completely, even on a night that seems quiet and ordinary. This happened only about 5 or 6 weeks ago. It was early spring, and it had been raining non-stop, so I was spending most of my time indoors, staying away from the weather. I had a stack of work papers that needed to be finished, so that night I was set up at my desk in the living room, typing away on my laptop. I was exhausted, and even though I had a cup of coffee right beside me, my eyelids still felt impossibly heavy. Every few minutes I'd lean back in my chair, stretch my arms and rub my eyes, trying to wake myself up before diving back into the work. But one of the times I leaned back, something caught my eye, and my heart almost jumped out of my chest. There was a face right outside the window across the room. What made it even more terrifying was that the man was staring straight at me, completely unfazed that I had noticed him. He just stood there with his face pressed against the glass, smiling. I jumped to my feet and locked eyes with him, still trying to process what I was seeing. Before I could even open my mouth, he suddenly stepped away from the window and disappeared. I had absolutely no experience dealing with someone watching me through my own window, so I had no idea how I was supposed to react. I had never seen that man before in my life. After a few seconds, I cautiously walked over and looked outside, but whoever he was had already vanished. The only proof he'd been there were muddy footprints cutting across my yard and leading straight into the trees. I backed away from the window and stood there in the middle of the room, taking a moment to calm myself down. I told myself that if I could just confirm he was really gone, maybe I could shake it off and get through the rest of the night without completely losing it. I grabbed my rain jacket, opened the front door, flipped on the outdoor lights, and stepped outside. The rain had eased up enough that I could see fairly clearly. I walked over to the spot beneath the window where he'd been standing. From there, I could see straight into my living room. My desk, my chair, the entire room was brightly lit and fully visible. Seeing my own space from that angle felt deeply uncomfortable, especially knowing someone had been standing right there, silently watching me. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I glanced back down at the muddy footprints and, for some reason, decided to follow them for a short distance. Looking back now, I know how reckless that was. I honestly don't know what was going through my head at the time. I tracked the prints until the trees grew thicker, and that's when I realized something was very wrong. The footprints were pointed toward my house. This was the direction he had come from, not where he'd gone. There were no signs of him leaving at all. My heart started pounding as the realization hit me. I spun around, suddenly overwhelmed with fear and desperate to get back inside. But when I looked toward the window again, I froze. Someone was standing inside my house, staring out at me. I didn't hesitate. I took off running toward the road and slammed on my neighbor's door until they woke up and let me inside. They immediately called the police for me. By the time officers arrived, the intruder was gone, but they discovered that the back door had been forced open, most likely while I was outside following the tracks. If I hadn't stepped out when I did and ended up face to face with that disturbed man inside my own home, I can't even imagine what could have happened.